This old woman can barely stand and doesn't even remember things. We must take care of her assets." My daughter-in-law testified against me. The judge looked straight at her and replied, "Madam, she is the most respected judge in the county. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never imagined that at 64 years old, after spending nearly 3 decades on the bench as one of the most respected judges in our county, I would find myself sitting in my own living room reading a legal petition that painted me as a senile old woman incapable of caring for herself. The papers trembled in my hands as I read the allegations. Petitioner seeks emergency guardianship of Loretta Hayes due to severe cognitive decline and inability to manage daily activities safely. The words felt like physical blows, each line more devastating than the last. My daughter-in-law Fallon had filed this petition. Fallon, who had been part of our family for 8 years, who I had welcomed with open arms when Marcus brought her home, who had given me 2 beautiful grandchildren I adored. The evidence she presented was methodical, detailed, and completely fabricated. Subject frequently forgets appointments and becomes confused about time and place, I read aloud to my empty house, my voice cracking. Last Tuesday, I had arrived 20 minutes late to lunch with my neighbor Dorothy because I'd lost track of time while reviewing case files. A normal occurrence for any busy professional, twisted into something sinister. Subject shows signs of paranoia and makes accusations against family members without basis. This referred to the time I'd questioned why Fallon needed access to my financial statements to help organize my affairs. When I'd politely declined, explaining I preferred to handle my own finances, she'd grown cold and distant. Subject exhibits dangerous behavior, such as leaving stove burners on and forgetting to lock doors. I stared at this line, feeling a chill run down my spine. 2 weeks ago, I'd been preparing dinner when the doorbell rang. It was a delivery man with a package for my neighbor. I'd signed for it and walked it over to Dorothy's house, chatting with her for perhaps 10 minutes. When I returned, I found the burner still on under my soup pot. I'd simply turned it off and thought nothing of it. How could Fallon possibly know about that unless she'd been watching my house? The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. She had been watching me, studying me, documenting every normal human moment of forgetfulness or distraction, and transforming them into evidence of mental incompetence. My hands shook as I continued reading. Subject's son, Marcus Hayes, supports this petition out of concern for his mother's well-being and safety. The betrayal cut deeper than any stranger's attack could have. My own son, my only child, the boy I'd raised alone after his father died when he was 12, had signed his name to this document declaring me unfit. I set the papers down and walked to my kitchen window, the same window where I'd stood countless mornings watching Marcus walk to the school bus, where I'd waited for him to come home from dates as a teenager, where I'd cried tears of joy watching him graduate from college. The view looked the same, but everything had changed. The phone rang, jolting me from my thoughts. I almost didn't answer, but years of judicial training had taught me to face problems head-on. "Mom?" Marcus's voice sounded strained, uncertain. "Hello, sweetheart." I kept my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. Did you get the papers?" "I did." I waited, hoping he would explain, would tell me this was all a mistake, that he'd been coerced somehow. Instead, there was a long silence before he said, "Fallon thinks it's for the best. She's worried about you living alone, and honestly, so am I." "Worried about what exactly?" I asked, my judicial instincts kicking in. Have I ever been anything but independent and capable? "It's not about the past, Mom. It's about, well, you're getting older. Last month when we visited, you seemed confused about what day it was. And Fallon mentioned you've been acting strangely lately." "Strangely how?" My voice was sharper now. Marcus hesitated, forgetting things, leaving appliances on. "She's just concerned that something could happen to you." The careful way he spoke told me everything I needed to know. These weren't his observations. These were Fallon's words coming out of his mouth. My successful, intelligent son, a marketing executive who negotiated million-dollar deals for a living, had been thoroughly manipulated by his wife. Marcus, I said carefully, when have you personally witnessed any of these incidents? Another pause. Well, Fallon told me about them. She wouldn't lie about something like this, Mom. She loves you. Love. The word felt bitter in my mouth. This was what love looked like in Fallon's world, stripping away someone's autonomy under the guise of protection. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my study, surrounded by law books and legal journals that had been my companions for decades. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd presided over hundreds of guardianship cases, had seen families torn apart by greed, manipulation, and false concern. I knew the signs, the patterns, the tactics used by those who sought to control vulnerable adults. The problem was I wasn't vulnerable. At least I hadn't been until now. I pulled out a legal pad and began making notes, the same way I'd approached every complex case throughout my career. But this time, I wasn't the judge. I was the target. The hearing was scheduled for next Friday. In less than a week, I would sit in a courtroom not behind the bench where I belonged, but at the defendant's table, fighting for my own freedom and dignity. The petition requested emergency temporary guardianship, which meant if the judge found in their favor, I could lose control of my finances, my medical decisions, even my living arrangements immediately. I thought about calling my attorney, Robert Fitzgerald, who'd handled my legal affairs for years. But something held me back. If I lawyered up immediately, it might be seen as confirmation that I needed help managing my affairs. The catch-22 was maddening. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction I'd had with Fallon over the past few months, the way she'd insisted on organizing my medicine cabinet to help me stay on track, the times she'd suggested I might want to consider a cleaning service because keeping up with housework gets harder as we age, the concerned looks she'd exchanged with Marcus when I'd told them about my decision to donate to a scholarship fund at the local law school. Every act of kindness had been a chess move. Every expression of concern had been gathering intelligence for this moment. The most painful part wasn't the legal battle ahead. It was the realization that my son, the person I loved most in this world, had chosen to believe the worst about me rather than standing by the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him. But I was Loretta Hayes. I had spent my career fighting for justice, protecting the innocent, and seeing through lies and manipulation. Fallon had made one critical mistake in her calculated attack. She had underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. The harassment began 3 days after I received the guardianship petition. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. Ironic, considering that was one of Fallon's allegations against me. But then I started paying attention with the same methodical precision I'd used to analyze evidence in my courtroom. Tuesday morning, I was at the grocery store when I noticed Fallon's friend Jennifer filming me with her phone. I was standing in the cereal aisle, comparing prices between 2 brands of oatmeal, a perfectly normal activity, but Jennifer positioned herself to capture the moment I picked up one box, put it back, then picked up another. To someone watching the video later, it might look like confusion or indecision rather than simple comparison shopping. When I approached Jennifer, she quickly put her phone away and pretended to be interested in the granola bars. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Hayes. What a coincidence running into you here." "Hello, Jennifer." I kept my voice pleasant but firm. "Were you just filming me?" Her face flushed red. "Filming? No, I was just checking my messages. You know how these phones are." She hurried away before I could respond. That afternoon, my neighbor Mrs. Patterson called. "Loretta, dear, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you feeling all right? Fallon stopped by earlier and mentioned you've been having some health concerns." My blood pressure spiked. "What exactly did she tell you?" "Well, she said you've been having some memory issues and that the family is worried about you living alone. She asked me to keep an eye on you and let her know if I noticed anything concerning." I felt the walls closing in around me. Fallon was systematically approaching my social circle, planting seeds of doubt about my mental capacity. She was creating a network of people who would be primed to see signs of decline that didn't exist. "Mrs. Patterson," I said carefully, "has there been anything about my behavior lately that's concerned you? Any conversations we've had where I seemed confused or disoriented?" There was a pause. "Well, no, dear. You've always been sharp as a tack." But Fallon seemed so worried. "And she knows you better than I do." That was the insidious part of Fallon's strategy. She was positioning herself as the expert on my condition, the concerned family member with insider knowledge. Meanwhile, she was training others to interpret my normal behavior through the lens of suspected dementia. Wednesday brought a visit from Marcus and Fallon. They arrived unannounced while I was in my garden, tending to my roses. I was dirty from weeding, my hair was disheveled, and I had soil under my fingernails. In other words, I looked exactly like someone who had been gardening. "Mom, what are you doing out here?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with that new tone of concerned condescension I was learning to hate. "Gardening," I replied, gesturing to the obvious. The roses needed deadheading, and the weeds were getting out of hand. Fallon exchanged a meaningful look with Marcus. "Loretta, sweetheart, it's almost 90 degrees out here. Don't you think you should come inside and cool off?" I glanced at my watch. It was barely 10 in the morning, and the temperature was probably in the mid-70s, but I knew this was another trap. If I corrected her, I'd be seen as argumentative. If I agreed, I'd be confirming that I had poor judgment about my own safety. "I was just finishing up," I said, pulling off my gardening gloves. Once inside, Fallon made a show of getting me a glass of water and checking to make sure I had sunscreen on. Her solicitousness felt like a performance, and I realized with growing alarm that Marcus was eating it up. He was seeing his wife as the caring daughter-in-law looking after his increasingly fragile mother. "Mom, we wanted to talk to you about getting some help around the house," Marcus said as we sat in my living room. "Maybe someone to come in a few times a week to help with cleaning and cooking." "I don't need help with cleaning and cooking," I replied. "I've been managing this house perfectly well for 23 years. Fallon leaned forward, her expression sympathetic. "Of course you have, Loretta. But things change as we get older. There's no shame in accepting a little assistance." "What things have changed?" I asked pointedly. "Specifically?" Another one of those loaded glances between them. "Well," Fallon said carefully, "Marcus mentioned that when he called last week, you seemed confused about what day it was." I stared at my son. "When exactly was this conversation?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I'm not sure of the exact day." "It was Thursday evening," I said. "You called while I was cooking dinner. You asked what I was up to over the weekend, and I said I wasn't sure yet because I needed to check my calendar." Checking one's calendar before making plans isn't confusion, Marcus. It's organization. The silence that followed was telling. Fallon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. She didn't like having her narrative challenged with facts. "The point is," she said, recovering quickly, "we all love you and want to make sure you're safe and comfortable. That's all this is about." After they left, I sat in my study and wrote down every detail of the conversation. I was building my own case file now, documenting each instance of their manipulation and distortion. Thursday evening brought the most disturbing development yet. I was cooking dinner when my smoke alarm went off. The chicken in my oven had started to smoke slightly, not burning, just the normal result of some spilled marinade hitting the hot oven floor. I turned off the oven, opened the windows, and fanned the smoke alarm until it stopped beeping. 20 minutes later, my doorbell rang. It was the fire department. "Ma'am, we received a call about a possible fire at this address," the captain said. "A fire?" "No, there's no fire. My smoke alarm went off briefly when something spilled in my oven, but it's fine now." He looked concerned. "The caller said they were worried about an elderly resident who might be in danger." Elderly resident. The phrase stung. "May I ask who called?" "It was an anonymous tip, ma'am. But since we're here, would you mind if we just take a quick look around to make sure everything's safe?" I invited them in, knowing I had no choice. They found nothing wrong, of course, but their visit had been witnessed by several neighbors. By tomorrow, the story would be that the fire department had to come check on Loretta Hayes because she'd had some kind of cooking incident. That night, I called my friend and former colleague, Judge Patricia Williams. We'd worked together for 15 years before her retirement, and I trusted her judgment implicitly. "Patty, I need some advice," I said, and explained the situation. Her response was immediate and fierce. "Loretta, this is elder abuse, classic financial and emotional manipulation. You need to fight this with everything you've got. But what if I'm wrong? What if I really am starting to slip and just don't see it?" "Stop right there," she said firmly. "I've known you for 20 years. Your mind is as sharp today as it was when you were 40. Don't let them gaslight you into questioning your own sanity. Her words were a lifeline, but they also crystallized my growing fear. If Fallon was willing to call the fire department to create a false emergency, what else was she capable of? How far would she go to build her case against me? I was about to find out. The hearing was only 2 days away, and I had the sinking feeling that Fallon's campaign of manufactured evidence was just getting started. As I prepared for bed that night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be a passive victim in this assault on my life and dignity. I was going to fight back, using every skill I'd acquired in 3 decades of legal practice. But first, I needed to survive whatever Fallon had planned for the next 48 hours. The courthouse felt foreign beneath my feet as I walked through doors I had entered thousands of times before. But this time, I wasn't wearing my judicial robes. I wasn't carrying case files to review. I was walking toward courtroom B as a defendant in my own life, wearing my best navy suit and carrying a folder that contained what little defense I could muster against my daughter-in-law's calculated attack. Judge Harold Morrison was presiding, a man I'd known professionally for 15 years, but who would have to pretend he didn't recognize me to maintain the appearance of impartiality. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me that this hearing was taking place in the very building where I'd spent my career protecting people from exactly this kind of abuse. The courtroom was more crowded than I'd expected. Fallon had done her work well, filling the gallery with neighbors, church acquaintances, and family friends who'd been primed to see me as a tragic figure in need of protection, rather than a competent woman fighting for her freedom. I sat at the respondents' table alone. I'd made the difficult decision not to hire an attorney, knowing it might be perceived as either proof that I couldn't manage my affairs or evidence that I was being unnecessarily combative. Either way, it would work against me. Fallon's attorney, James Butler, was a specialist in elder law, and not the kind who protected seniors. He was the kind who made lucrative careers out of guardianship cases, taking substantial fees from the estates he helped place under court control. His opening statement was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. "Your Honor, this is not a complicated case," Butler began, his voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "We have a once capable woman who is experiencing the natural but heartbreaking decline that affects so many of our senior citizens." The respondent, Loretta Hayes, was once a vital, independent person. But age has begun to take its toll. I forced myself to remain expressionless as he painted a picture of a confused, dangerous old woman whose family was reluctantly seeking court intervention out of love and concern. The petitioner, Mrs. Fallon Hayes, comes before this court not seeking personal gain, but desperately trying to protect her beloved mother-in-law from the dangers that her condition now presents. Beloved mother-in-law. I almost laughed at the audacity. Butler's first witness was Dr. Robert Chen, a physician I'd never met who claimed to have evaluated me based on reports from family members. His testimony was devastating in its clinical detachment. Based on the behavioral patterns described to me by the family, Mrs. Hayes appears to be exhibiting signs consistent with early-stage dementia. The incidents of confusion, memory loss, and poor judgment are classic indicators of cognitive decline. "Doctor," Butler continued, "in your professional opinion, would it be dangerous for Mrs. Hayes to continue living independently? Given the documented incidents, leaving appliances on, becoming disoriented about time and place, exhibiting paranoid behavior toward family members, yes, I believe independent living poses significant safety risks." The documented incidents, each one carefully orchestrated by Fallon and presented as medical fact by a doctor who had never actually examined me. When Butler offered Dr. Chen for cross-examination, I stood slowly. This was my first chance to fight back, and I intended to make it count. "Dr. Chen, you mentioned that your evaluation was based on reports from family members. Did you personally examine me?" "No, I did not." "Did you review any of my medical records?" I was told that Mrs. Hayes had refused to release her medical records for evaluation. I felt a flash of anger. "Doctor, I was never asked to release any medical records. This is the first I'm hearing of any such request." Butler objected, but Judge Morrison allowed the question to stand, a small crack in their perfect narrative. "Dr. Chen, Are you aware that making a dementia diagnosis typically requires extensive testing, including cognitive assessments, brain imaging, and blood work? Yes, of course. And you performed none of these tests? No, but the family reports were quite detailed and consistent with, Doctor, if I told you that I could recite the constitutional amendments in order, explain the legal precedents that shaped modern tort law, and balance my checkbook to the penny, would that change your assessment? Dr. Chen looked uncomfortable. I would need to evaluate that information in context. The context being actual facts rather than hearsay? Butler's objection was sustained this time, but I'd made my point. Dr. Chen's evaluation was worthless, and anyone paying attention could see it. Next came the parade of witnesses Fallon had assembled. Mrs. Patterson testified about my confusion when Fallon had warned her about my condition. Jennifer described filming me in the grocery store, claiming she'd been concerned about my behavior. The fire department captain testified about the smoke alarm incident, though he admitted there had been no actual fire or danger. Each witness painted the same picture. A once sharp woman now losing her grip on reality, a danger to herself and others. The cumulative effect was damning, even though I could see the manipulation behind every piece of testimony. But the worst was yet to come. Your Honor, I call Marcus Hayes to the stand. My heart broke as my son walked to the witness box. He wouldn't meet my eyes as he was sworn in. This was the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager I'd stayed up late helping with algebra homework, the young man I'd been so proud to watch graduate from college. Now he was about to testify against me in open court. Butler's questioning was gentle, designed to portray Marcus as a loving son making an agonizing decision. Mr. Hayes, this must be incredibly difficult for you. It is, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. I love my mother. She's always been my hero. But lately, what have you observed lately that concerns you? Marcus finally looked at me, and I saw genuine anguish in his eyes. For a moment, I thought he might recant, might tell the truth about Fallon's manipulation. Instead, he repeated the lies his wife had fed him. She seems confused about time. Last week, she thought our lunch was on Tuesday when it was scheduled for Thursday. She's been making strange financial decisions, donating large amounts to charities without discussing it with family. And there have been safety issues, leaving the stove on, forgetting to lock doors. Each word was a knife in my chest. My own child, weaponized against me by a woman who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to her ambitions. Mr. Hayes, do you believe your mother is capable of safely managing her own affairs? Marcus was crying now, tears streaming down his face. I don't think she is, and it kills me to say that, but I can't live with myself if something happens to her because I was too selfish to speak up. Selfish. The word hit me like a physical blow. Marcus genuinely believed he was protecting me. Fallon had manipulated him so completely that he saw his betrayal as an act of love. When it was my turn to question him, I stood on shaking legs. This was my son, but I had to treat him like any other hostile witness. Marcus, you mentioned financial decisions that concerned you. Are you referring to my donation to the law school scholarship fund? Yes, among other things. Are you aware that I've donated to that fund every year for the past decade? He looked confused. No, I didn't know that. Are you aware of my current financial situation? My assets, my debts, my monthly expenses? Well, no, but... So when you testified about strange financial decisions, you were actually testifying about decisions made by someone whose financial situation you know nothing about. Marcus looked stricken. Mom, I just want to protect you. From what, sweetheart? From continuing to live the same responsible, independent life I've lived for decades? Butler objected before Marcus could answer, but the damage was done. My son's testimony was falling apart under scrutiny, revealing itself as the product of manipulation rather than genuine observation. But the worst moment came when Butler called his star witness. Your Honor, I call Fallon Hayes to the stand. My daughter-in-law walked to the witness box with the confidence of someone who believed she'd already won. She was perfectly dressed in a conservative gray suit, her hair pulled back in a modest bun, her makeup applied to suggest natural beauty without vanity. Everything about her appearance was calculated to present her as the responsible, caring family member. Her testimony was a tour de force of crocodile tears and manufactured concern. She spoke about her love for me, her anguish at watching my decline, her desperate attempts to help me maintain my dignity while keeping me safe. Mrs. Hayes, can you describe some specific incidents that led to your decision to seek guardianship? Fallon dabbed at her eyes with a tissue before responding. It's so hard to talk about because I love Loretta so much. But there have been so many concerning incidents. Last month, I found her standing in her kitchen at 2 in the morning, fully dressed, insisting it was time to go to work. When I gently reminded her that she's retired, she became angry and accused me of trying to control her. I stared at her in shock. This incident had never happened. She was lying under oath, creating detailed scenarios that existed only in her imagination. She's been giving away family heirlooms to strangers, Fallon continued. Important pieces that have been in the family for generations. When Marcus tried to discuss it with her, she became paranoid and accused us of trying to steal from her. Another complete fabrication. I hadn't given away any family heirlooms to anyone. Most concerning are the safety issues. I found her front door unlocked in the middle of the night. She's left water running until it flooded the bathroom. Last week, I arrived to find her house full of smoke because she'd forgotten something in the oven, and then couldn't remember how to turn off the smoke alarm. The smoke alarm incident, twisted beyond recognition. In Fallon's version, I was a confused old woman who couldn't operate basic household appliances. In reality, I'd handled a minor kitchen mishap with complete competence. But the masterpiece of her performance came when Butler asked about my relationship with Marcus. How has Mrs. Hayes' condition affected her relationship with her son? Fallon's voice broke convincingly. It's heartbreaking. She's become increasingly hostile toward Marcus, accusing him of working against her. Last week, she told him that he was a disappointment, and that she wished she'd never had children. She doesn't seem to remember how much he's always loved her. The lie was so outrageous, so completely opposite to reality that I felt physical nausea. But I could see it working on the courtroom audience. People were nodding sympathetically, looking at me with pity and concern. Marcus looked devastated, confirming that this was the first he'd heard of this alleged conversation, because it had never happened. When Fallon stepped down from the witness stand, she looked directly at me with a small, triumphant smile that only I could see. She thought she'd won. And looking around the courtroom at the faces filled with sympathy for her and concern for me, I was terrified that she might be right. The recess felt like an eternity. I sat alone at the respondents' table, watching Fallon hold court in the hallway, surrounded by sympathetic faces and nodding heads. She'd positioned herself perfectly, the devoted daughter-in-law making heartbreaking sacrifices for a woman too proud to accept help. Marcus stood beside her, his face a mask of guilt and confusion. I could see him struggling with what he'd heard, probably wondering if the mother he'd known his entire life had somehow become a stranger. Fallon had done her work so well that my own son was doubting his memories of me. Judge Morrison returned to the bench, and I felt the weight of 30 years of legal experience settling on my shoulders. This was it, my chance to defend myself against the most sophisticated character assassination I'd ever witnessed. Everything I'd learned about evidence, testimony, and human nature would have to serve me now. Mrs. Hayes, you may present your defense. I stood slowly, gathering the few documents I'd managed to prepare. Without an attorney, I had to represent myself, which meant I was about to cross-examine witnesses and present evidence in front of colleagues who knew me as a judge, not a defendant. Your Honor, I'd like to call Dr. Margaret Foster to the stand. Dr. Foster was my personal physician for the past 12 years. I'd managed to convince her to testify on short notice, though she'd seemed reluctant to get involved in what she called a family matter. Dr. Foster, when did you last examine me? 2 weeks ago for your annual physical. And what was your assessment of my cognitive function? Mrs. Hayes showed no signs of cognitive impairment. Her memory was sharp, her reasoning clear, and her responses to mental status questions were all within normal ranges. Butler objected. Your Honor, this witness wasn't disclosed prior to— Your Honor, I interrupted. Dr. Foster is my treating physician. Her testimony is directly relevant to the medical claims made by the petitioner's expert, who never examined me at all. Judge Morrison allowed the testimony to continue. Dr. Foster, are you aware of any medical conditions I have that would affect my ability to live independently? None whatsoever. Mrs. Hayes is in excellent health for her age. Her blood pressure is well controlled, her cognitive function is intact, and she maintains an active lifestyle. Have I ever discussed with you any incidents of confusion, memory loss, or disorientation? No. In all our interactions, Mrs. Hayes has been articulate, well-informed about her health, and completely competent to make her own medical decisions. Butler's cross-examination was brief but pointed. Dr. Foster, isn't it true that early-stage dementia can be difficult to detect in a clinical setting? That's correct, and patients often present differently to their doctors than they do at home? Sometimes, yes. So you can't rule out the possibility that Mrs. Hayes might be experiencing cognitive decline that hasn't yet manifested in your office? Dr. Foster hesitated. I can't rule out any possibility completely, but based on my examination and ongoing relationship with Mrs. Hayes, I see no evidence of cognitive impairment. It wasn't a ringing endorsement, but it was something. I called my neighbor Dorothy Patterson back to the stand over Butler's objections. Mrs. Patterson, you testified earlier about concerns regarding my mental state. Who first brought these concerns to your attention? Well, it was Fallon. She came by about 3 weeks ago. Prior to that conversation with Fallon, had you noticed anything concerning about my behavior? Dorothy looked uncomfortable. No, I hadn't. You've always been very sharp, Loretta. I was actually surprised when Fallon mentioned problems because you seemed fine to me. After Fallon spoke with you, did you find yourself looking for signs of confusion or memory problems in our interactions? Well, yes. She asked me to keep an eye on you. And did you find any such signs? Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Not really, no. You've been the same Loretta you've always been. Mrs. Patterson, when you testified about my confusion regarding what day it was, can you recall the specific incident? Well, Fallon told me about it, but I didn't witness it myself. Another crack in their foundation. I pressed on. In fact, Mrs. Patterson, have you personally witnessed any of the incidents described in today's testimony? No, I haven't. So your testimony was based entirely on what Fallon told you to look for and report. Dorothy's face flushed red. I suppose. Yes. Butler objected, but the damage was done. I was systematically revealing that the case against me was built on a foundation of hearsay and manipulation. But my next move was risky. I had to testify on my own behalf, and I knew Butler would try to trap me during cross-examination. Your Honor, I'd like to testify in my own defense. As I walked to the witness stand, I felt the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on me. This was my moment to speak my truth, to show them who I really was beneath the layers of lies Fallon had constructed. Mrs. Hayes, I began, representing myself in the strange experience of examining myself. Can you tell the court about your current living situation? I live independently in the home I've owned for 23 years. I manage all my own affairs, financial, medical, and personal. I drive myself to appointments, maintain my property, and live an active social life. Are you aware of the allegations made against you today? I am, and they're false. Every single incident described by Mrs. Fallon Hayes either never happened or has been grossly distorted. I went through each allegation methodically, providing context and contradicting the lies with facts. The midnight confusion incident, it never happened. The hostile conversation with Marcus, complete fabrication. The safety hazards, normal household incidents blown out of proportion. Mrs. Hayes, do you understand why your family might be concerned about your welfare? I understand that my son loves me and wants to protect me. What I don't understand is why he's chosen to believe the word of someone who has systematically deceived him rather than trusting his own 38 years of experience with me. When Butler stood for cross-examination, I braced myself. Mrs. Hayes, isn't it true that you've been resistant to accepting help from your family? I've been resistant to accepting help I don't need, yes. And isn't it possible that your judgment about what help you need might be impaired? Is it possible that a woman who has spent 30 years making complex legal decisions, who manages her own finances, who maintains her own home, and who has no medical evidence of cognitive decline, might actually be competent to assess her own needs? Yes, I believe that's not only possible but probable, Mrs. Hayes. Several witnesses have testified about concerning behaviors. Are you saying they're all lying? This was the trap. If I said yes, I'd sound paranoid. If I said no, I'd be admitting to the behaviors. I'm saying that several witnesses have testified about behaviors that were either misinterpreted or, in some cases, completely fabricated. I'm saying that when you prime people to look for signs of incompetence, they often find them even where they don't exist. That's a very serious accusation, Mrs. Hayes. Yes, it is. And I'm prepared to prove it. I reached into my folder and pulled out a document I'd prepared that morning. A timeline of every interaction I'd had with Fallon over the past 6 months, complete with dates, witnesses, and documentation where available. Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit A, a comprehensive timeline showing the pattern of manufactured incidents that form the basis of this petition. Butler objected, claiming the timeline was inadmissible, but Judge Morrison allowed it into evidence. As I walked through each incident, showing how Fallon had either created false emergencies or twisted normal events into signs of incompetence, I could see the atmosphere in the courtroom beginning to shift. People were starting to pay attention to the details, to notice the inconsistencies in Fallon's carefully constructed narrative. But the real turning point came when Judge Morrison asked a question that changed everything. Mrs. Hayes, this court proceeding requires a significant understanding of legal processes and procedures. You've represented yourself today, cross-examined witnesses, presented evidence, and made legal arguments. How do you reconcile this level of competence with the allegations of cognitive decline? I took a deep breath. This was my moment. Your Honor, I reconcile it by pointing out that the allegations are false. I am Loretta Hayes. For the past 28 years, I have served as a judge in this very courthouse. I have presided over hundreds of cases, including many guardianship proceedings. I am not a confused elderly woman who needs protection from herself. I am a retired jurist who is being targeted by someone who sees my independence as an obstacle to her own ambitions. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear people shifting in their seats, murmuring to each other. Judge Morrison's eyes widened slightly, though he maintained his professional composure. Mrs. Hayes, are you saying you are Judge Loretta Hayes from this court? I am, Your Honor. Judge Morrison looked down at his files, then back at me. Mrs. Hayes, I'm going to call a recess to review the court records. As the gavel fell, I saw Fallon's face go white. For the first time since this nightmare began, she looked genuinely afraid. Marcus was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time, his mouth slightly open in shock. The truth was finally out. Now I had to hope it wasn't too late to save myself from the trap my own daughter-in-law had so carefully constructed. The 30-minute recess felt like the longest half-hour of my life. I sat in the hallway, watching as the dynamics in the courthouse shifted like tectonic plates. Word had spread quickly through the building that Judge Loretta Hayes was fighting a guardianship petition filed by her own family. Court clerks I'd worked with for decades approached me with shocked expressions and whispered words of support. Judge Hayes, we had no idea, said Maria Santos, the chief clerk. When I saw your name on the docket, I assumed it was a coincidence. Marcus stood across the hall, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Confusion, shame, and something that might have been the beginning of recognition flickered across his face. Fallon was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear her voice from around the corner, speaking in urgent, hushed tones on her phone. When we reconvened, Judge Morrison's demeanor had changed completely. He'd clearly spent the recess reviewing my judicial record, and the weight of what was happening had settled on him. Before we continue, he announced, I want to state for the record that Judge Loretta Hayes served with distinction in this courthouse for 28 years before her retirement 18 months ago. Her record speaks for itself. The murmur that went through the courtroom was audible. I could see people reassessing everything they'd heard, viewing Fallon's testimony through a completely different lens. Mr. Butler, Judge Morrison continued, I'm troubled by the fact that your client failed to disclose Mrs. Hayes's professional background in the petition. This seems like a significant omission. Butler looked uncomfortable for the first time all day. Your Honor, my client may not have been aware of the relevance. Mr. Butler, your client lived in the same household as Judge Hayes for 8 years. She attended retirement parties and judicial events. The idea that she was unaware of Mrs. Hayes's professional capacity strains credibility. I seized the moment. Your Honor, may I present additional evidence? Proceed, Mrs. Hayes. I stood and walked to the evidence table, retrieving a thick folder I'd kept in reserve. Your Honor, I'd like to present a series of documents that I believe will illuminate the true nature of this case. The first document was a detailed financial analysis I'd prepared the night before, showing my assets, income, and expenditures over the past 2 years. This shows that my financial management has been exemplary. Every donation, every investment, every expenditure has been carefully considered and well within my means. The second set of documents was correspondence with various organizations where I volunteered and served on boards. These letters from the Legal Aid Society, the Bar Association, and the Community Foundation show that I have remained actively engaged in meaningful work since my retirement. None of these organizations have expressed any concerns about my competence. But the third set of documents was my nuclear option. Your Honor, I'd also like to present these phone records, which show a pattern of communication between Mrs. Fallon Hayes and several of today's witnesses in the days immediately preceding their testimony. Butler shot to his feet. Objection. These records were obtained without proper— Your Honor, I interrupted. These are my own phone records, showing calls made to my residence. I have every right to present them. I walked through the timeline methodically. The day after Fallon filed the petition, she'd made a 15-minute call to Jennifer Morrison, the woman who'd filmed me in the grocery store. 2 days later, a 12-minute call to Mrs. Patterson. The day before the hearing, a 20-minute call to the fire captain who'd testified about the smoke alarm incident. Your Honor, this pattern suggests witness coordination that goes far beyond normal case preparation. It suggests witness coaching. But my most damning evidence came next. Your Honor, I'd like to present this audio recording. Butler was on his feet again. Objection. No foundation has been laid for— Your Honor, this is a recording from my home security system, which I installed last month after beginning to suspect I was being watched. Judge Morrison reviewed the technical specifications of the recording system and allowed it into evidence. The audio was from 3 days before the hearing. Fallon's voice was crystal clear as she spoke to someone on the phone while standing on my front porch, apparently believing I wasn't home. The old bat is tougher than I expected. Fallon's voice came through the courtroom speakers. But it doesn't matter. Even if she fights, who's going to believe her over all of us? Marcus is completely convinced, and once we get guardianship, we can sell that house and put her somewhere she can't cause problems. The courtroom erupted. People gasped, some stood up, and I could hear angry murmurs throughout the gallery. Marcus looked like he'd been struck by lightning, but Fallon's voice continued on the recording. Don't worry about the judge. Morrison's an old-fashioned guy who thinks family knows best. Besides, the stupid woman didn't even hire a lawyer. This will be over by noon, and then we can move forward with our plans. Judge Morrison gavelled for order, his face grim. Mrs. Hayes, he said, do you have additional recordings? I do, Your Honor. The next recording was even more damaging. It was Fallon coaching Jennifer on what to say about the grocery store incident. Just say she looked confused and disoriented. Don't mention that she was comparing prices or reading labels. Make it sound like she was wandering around lost. But she didn't look lost, Fallon. She looked like she was shopping. Jennifer, do you want to help me protect Marcus's inheritance or not? Because if this doesn't work, that money goes to nursing homes and lawyers instead of staying in the family. The final recording was the most devastating. It was Fallon talking to someone I couldn't identify about the smoke alarm incident. I need you to call the fire department and report a possible kitchen fire at this address. Don't give your name. Just say you're worried about an elderly resident who might be in danger. Fallon, that's fraud. I could get in trouble for filing a false report. It's not false if you're genuinely concerned about someone's safety. And you are concerned, right? You're concerned that Loretta might hurt herself with her declining mental state. By the time the recordings finished, the courtroom was in chaos. Marcus had put his head in his hands and was visibly crying. Several people in the gallery were shouting at Fallon, who had gone completely white and appeared to be in shock. Order! Judge Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly. I will have order in this courtroom. When the noise died down, he turned to Butler. Mr. Butler, does your client wish to withdraw this petition? Butler was frantically consulting with Fallon, who appeared to be having some kind of breakdown. She was shaking her head violently and seemed to be denying what everyone had just heard with their own ears. Your Honor, Butler said finally, my client maintains that these recordings are taken out of context and don't reflect. Mr. Butler, Judge Morrison's voice was ice cold. These recordings document your client discussing witness coaching, fraud, and filing false police reports. Are you seriously suggesting we should overlook felony charges because of context? That's when Fallon made her biggest mistake. She stood up suddenly, pointing an accusing finger at me. She's lying, she screamed. Those recordings are fake. She probably had someone make them to frame me. This is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior I've been talking about. The silence that followed was deadly. Every person in that courtroom was staring at a woman who had just accused a retired judge of fabricating evidence and filing false police reports. The same woman who, minutes earlier, had been caught on tape discussing how to manipulate the very proceeding we were sitting in. Judge Morrison's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of 3 decades on the bench. Mrs. Fallon Hayes, you are held in contempt of court. Bailiff, please escort Mrs. Hayes to holding pending criminal charges for perjury, filing false police reports, and witness tampering. As the bailiff approached her, Fallon's composure completely collapsed. You can't do this to me. I have children. I was just trying to protect my family. She's going to die soon anyway, and then what happens to Marcus? What happens to my kids' inheritance? With those words, she'd revealed her true motivation for everyone to hear. This had never been about my safety or well-being. It had been about money and control, about removing me as an obstacle to her plans for what she saw as her rightful inheritance. As they led her away in handcuffs, still screaming about her rights and how unfair this was, Marcus finally approached me. His face was streaked with tears, and he looked like a man who'd just watched his entire world collapse. Mom, he whispered, I'm so sorry. I don't know how I could have been so blind. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved, who had been so thoroughly manipulated that he'd testified against me in open court. The hurt was still there, raw and deep, but underneath it was something else. Relief that he was finally seeing the truth. We'll talk later, sweetheart, I said quietly. Right now, I think we both need time to process what just happened. Judge Morrison dismissed the petition with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled. He also ordered an investigation into all the witnesses who had participated in Fallon's scheme, particularly those who had made false statements under oath. As I walked out of the courthouse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: freedom. Not just from the immediate threat Fallon had posed, but from the years of walking on eggshells around her, of second-guessing myself, of wondering if her subtle criticisms and suggestions might have some merit. But my victory came with a cost. My relationship with Marcus was damaged, perhaps irreparably. My faith and family loyalty had been shattered, and I knew that even though I'd won this battle, the war for my son's soul was far from over. Still, as I stepped into the afternoon sunlight, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Fallon had underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. She'd forgotten that before I was anyone's mother or mother-in-law, I was Loretta Hayes, and I didn't go down without a fight. 6 months after the hearing, I was sitting in my garden when Marcus's car pulled into my driveway. It had become our routine, Sunday afternoon visits where we slowly rebuilt what Fallon had nearly destroyed. The process was painful, like physical therapy after a devastating injury. But we were both committed to healing. He looked older somehow, the past months having etched lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, and while he'd retained custody of the children, the legal bills and emotional toll had changed him in fundamental ways. How are Emma and Tyler adjusting? I asked as he settled into the chair beside me. My grandchildren, caught in the middle of their mother's manipulation and their father's awakening, had been seeing a family therapist to help them understand what had happened better, Marcus said, though his voice still carried the weight of guilt. Emma asked about you yesterday. She wants to know when she can come visit again. It had taken months for me to feel comfortable around the children, not because I blame them for their mother's actions, but because Fallon had spent years poisoning them against me in subtle ways. Emma, now 9, had been taught to see me as the grandmother who didn't care enough to remember their birthdays, because Fallon had been intercepting my gifts. Tyler, 7, had been told I was too old and fragile to play with them properly, because Fallon wanted to limit our bonding time. Bring them next Sunday, I said. I'll make that chocolate cake Tyler likes. Marcus nodded, then pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. The prosecutor called yesterday. Fallon's sentencing is set for next month. I took the envelope but didn't open it immediately. Fallon had pleaded guilty to multiple charges rather than risk a trial that would have exposed even more of her manipulation. The evidence against her had been overwhelming once investigators started digging into her pattern of behavior. Are you going to attend? Marcus asked. I considered the question. Part of me wanted to be there, to see justice served for what she'd put me through. But a larger part of me was simply tired of having Fallon at the center of my thoughts. No, I said finally. I've spent enough time in that woman's orbit. I'd rather focus on our family moving forward. The investigation that followed the hearing had revealed the true scope of Fallon's manipulation. She'd been systematically isolating me from friends and family for years, spreading subtle doubts about my mental capacity while positioning herself as my primary caregiver and advocate. She'd coached Marcus to see normal aging behaviors as signs of decline, and she'd created a network of people primed to confirm her narrative. Most damaging of all, she'd been planning this guardianship petition for over a year, carefully documenting incidents and building her case with the patience of a predator stalking prey. The thing I keep thinking about, Marcus said, staring at his hands, is how completely I believed her. She made me doubt my own memories of you, my own experiences. I started questioning whether the mother I'd known my whole life had ever really existed. I reached over and took his hand. That's what skilled manipulators do, sweetheart. They don't just lie to others. They make their victims lie to themselves. But I should have known better. I should have trusted you over her. You loved her. You wanted to believe the best about her. There's no shame in that. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the roses I'd been tending bloom in the afternoon sun. These were the same roses Fallon had suggested I hire someone to care for because gardening gets so difficult as we age. Now they were thriving under my direct attention, a small symbol of the independence I'd fought so hard to preserve. Mom, Marcus said eventually, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. I braced myself, not sure what was coming. Do you forgive me? For what I did in that courtroom? For choosing her word over yours? The question hung in the air between us. It was the conversation we'd been building toward for months, the one that would determine whether our relationship could truly heal or would remain forever damaged by what had happened. Marcus, I said carefully, forgiveness isn't the right word. You were a victim too, just like I was. Fallon spent years conditioning you to doubt me, to see me through her filter. You didn't betray me deliberately. You were manipulated into it. He was crying now, tears he'd been holding back for months finally spilling over. But I testified against you. I said things that could have cost you your freedom. And then you listened when the truth came out. You didn't double down on the lies or try to protect your ego. You faced what had happened and committed to making it right. That takes courage. The healing process hadn't been easy. There were days when the hurt felt fresh, when I'd remember the look on Marcus's face as he testified about my supposed incompetence. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I'd ever be able to trust him completely again. But there were also moments like these, when I could see the man I'd raised, fundamentally decent, capable of growth, willing to do the hard work of rebuilding what had been broken. I've been thinking about something Dr. Williams said, Marcus continued. The family therapist had been working with all of us, helping us understand the dynamics that had made Fallon's manipulation possible. She said that healthy families don't require their members to choose sides, but toxic people always do. I nodded. It was true. Fallon had systematically created situations where Marcus felt he had to choose between supporting his wife or believing his mother. She'd made normal family disagreements into loyalty tests, gradually training him to see me as the problem rather than recognizing her as the source of conflict. "I see it now," he said. "All those times she'd ask me to talk to you about something, as if you were a difficult child instead of a competent adult. All those suggestions about what you needed or what would be best for you, without ever actually asking what you wanted. The saddest part," I said, "is that she had everything she could have wanted. A loving husband, beautiful children, financial security. But it wasn't enough because it wasn't complete control." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Do you think she ever really loved any of us? Or were we all just means to an end?" It was a question I'd wrestled with myself. I think she loved the idea of the life she'd built. The status, the security, the image of the perfect family. But love requires seeing other people as fully human, not as characters in your personal story. As the afternoon sun began to set, Marcus helped me water the garden. It was a simple domestic task, but it felt symbolic somehow. Two people working together to nurture something beautiful, to create rather than destroy. "Mom," he said as we finished, "I want you to know that I'm never going to let anyone treat you like that again. Not a future partner, not friends, not anyone. I know what real manipulation looks like now, and I won't be fooled again." I smiled at his earnestness, though I knew that healing from this kind of psychological abuse was more complex than simply promising to be more vigilant. Just remember that the most important thing is to trust your own instincts. When someone tries to make you doubt your own perceptions, that's usually a red flag. That evening, after Marcus left, I finally opened the envelope he'd brought. It contained the victim impact statement I could submit for Fallon's sentencing hearing. The prosecutor had encouraged me to attend, to tell the court how her actions had affected my life. I sat at my kitchen table with a pen in my hand, thinking about what I would want to say to the woman who had tried to steal my freedom, my dignity, and my relationship with my son. But as I started to write, I realized I had nothing to say to Fallon. My words weren't for her. They were for other victims who might read them someday, other families who might recognize the warning signs before it was too late. "The most insidious form of abuse," I wrote, "is the kind that masquerades as love. When someone claims to be protecting you while systematically destroying your autonomy, when someone says they're concerned about your welfare while isolating you from support systems, when someone positions themselves as your advocate while undermining your credibility. These are not acts of love, they are acts of control." I wrote about the importance of trusting your own perceptions, about the difference between genuine concern and manufactured crisis, about the way skilled manipulators use others' love and loyalty as weapons against them. But I also wrote about recovery, about the possibility of rebuilding relationships damaged by manipulation, about the strength that comes from surviving an attack on your very sense of self. When I finished, it was nearly midnight. I sealed the statement in an envelope and placed it on my kitchen counter. Tomorrow, I would decide whether to submit it to the court. Tonight, I was simply grateful to be sitting in my own home, in complete control of my own life, surrounded by the choices I'd made for myself. Fallon had underestimated me from the beginning, seeing an aging woman rather than an experienced judge, seeing isolation rather than independence, seeing vulnerability rather than strength. Her greatest mistake had been believing that because I was older, I was weaker. She'd learned too late that some people grow stronger with age, that experience teaches lessons that youth cannot imagine, and that a woman who has spent her career fighting for justice doesn't simply surrender when the fight comes to her own doorstep. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. Not just the absence of conflict, but the deep satisfaction that comes from standing your ground, protecting what matters, and refusing to let others define your worth. Fallon was going to prison, but that wasn't my victory. My victory was this: I was still here, still independent, still myself. and no one would ever be allowed to take that away from me again. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.